few weeks ago, I was doing a talk in front of what is, for me, a very large audience of over 1,000 business leaders, and a question that bubbled up to the top of that group was a question that has been perplexing me, as it's based, to be honest with you, on a lie. First off, my name is Liam Martin. If you don't know me, I've been working remotely for almost 20 years, and I founded a few companies that are heavily connected to remote work, so I want to kind of declare my bias before we get into this. I also run the largest conference on remote work, Running Remote, which we've run for 6 years outside of COVID, which really sucked, by the way, for all events. The attendee asked, I know we need to get all of our people back into the office, but we don't know how to do it. My immediate response was, who told you that you needed to actually get all your people back into the office? She said, everything I'm reading, and a large group of attendees in that room nodded in agreement with me. The reality is that there is a vast majority of information on returning to the office that's truly and honestly based on a lie. A lie that is specifically built to reverse one of the few good things that we got out of the pandemic, the ability to work remotely. These lies are all perpetrated by multinationals whose businesses depend on everyone going back to the office, or they might be faced with losing trillions and trillions of dollars in market share. A lot of people would say, if you looked at the media headlines today, that remote work is dead. Scary headlines like 90% of companies are going to force their employees back into the office in 2024, or remote work is in the single digits. Just 3 years ago, there were dozens of peer-reviewed studies showing that remote work was better for workers' productivity, attrition, and the growth of those companies. So why in the holy hell is everyone losing their minds on ordering everyone back to the office? Here's the deal. Remote work is better for productivity, better for attrition, and most importantly, better for the profitability of companies. So it's so incredibly confusing to me as to why companies would work counter to their interest. That's until I started to look at the research that has been coming out essentially over the last year that's reinforcing what I'm calling a propaganda campaign to convince you as a business owner that remote work doesn't work. In this video, I hope to lay out why employees say they're pushing their employees back to the office, the real reasons why they're actually doing it, and the narrative that's helping this entire process happen. I've collected the most complete academically reviewed data sets I could get my hands on to see once and for all, where's remote work going, what information is real versus media manipulation, and whether there actually is a conspiracy to get people back into the office through companies that need those employees back in the office or face not just billions, but trillions of dollars in debt that's coming due. I've actually contacted the people who produced the studies, and some of their responses are absolutely insane of what they say versus how the media has actually manipulated those studies for what I believe is simply corporate greed versus the happiness of all workers everywhere.
The days of working from home are fading for more employees, now being called back to the office. CEO Bob Iger writing in a letter, nothing can replace the ability to connect, observe, and create with peers that comes from being physically together.
But to figure all that out, I first have to tell you about what happened in March of 2020. When COVID first started, and Trump made that really weird announcement, then literally walked it back a month later.
To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
The economy quite literally shut down completely. And one of the few, if not only silver linings that came out of all of this was a boom towards remote work.
COVID has been a transformation.
Tech companies are leading the charge towards remote working. Twitter has already said its staff need never come back to the office if they don't want to. Facebook says half its staff could be working remotely in a decade.
That put the jump at 4% pre-pandemic levels to 67% just a month later in March of 2020. That's the biggest shift in work since the Industrial Revolution, but instead of 80 years, we literally did that in March. I know, like many of you, were probably thinking, how long would this last? Would this be weeks, months, years, or maybe this is just going to become the new normal? As data shows, that's essentially is the new normal. But if you read anything today, you'd confusingly get the opposite perspective. Pieces like 2/3 of CEOs think staff will return to the office 5 days a week, or more workers returning to New York City office than previously reported in study, New York Post, or 9 out of 10 companies will require employees to come back to the office in 2024 from Forbes. The issue is, with all of this data, you need to look at the source of the information and the publisher's bias. Let's just take the New York Post piece stating 9 out of 10 companies will require employees to come back to the office. Well, if you looked at the survey, you'd actually find something that says something incredibly different. One of the survey questions states that the percentage of employees required to work in person at least once per week is actually going down, not up. In 2023, 36% of respondents stated that employees must come into the office 5 days per week, and in 2024, that number would be cut to 19%. Another way of titling this survey would be "The 5-day in-office workday is collapsing in on itself." Now, we're not going to talk about that one, obviously, because that one is not friendly to the office. A study by Unispace found that 42% of companies that forced their employees back into the office saw a higher level of employee attrition than anticipated. Scoop, a company that helps organizations manage both flexible work, has created what they call the Flex Index, and their findings are very much against the narrative that we currently see. Companies that are fully flexible, i.e. they can voluntarily come into the office whenever they want, saw a 1.9% increase in headcount in comparison to structured hybrid at 1.5%, which basically means come in 1 or 2 days per week or you're going to get fired, and full-time in office at 0.8%. Companies that were remote or required at least 1 day in the office per week grew on average 4.8% over the last 12 months, in comparison to companies that required 5 days in the office, which grew at 2.6% last year. Remote-friendly companies are literally growing at double the rate of on-premise companies. From January to July of 2023, full-time in-office requirements dropped from 49% to 39%, and remote flexible working agreements went from 51% to 61% respectively. Lastly, we can see that remote versus in-office is truly a story of innovators versus corporates. If you have less than 500 employees in your company, you're at 88% remote or hybrid, and only 13% of those companies require you to actually come into an office full-time in comparison to 25,000 seat plus organizations, where less than 16% are remote or fully flexible, and 59% are structured hybrid, with 25% of those workers forced to work in the office 5 days per week. This is where it gets really spicy. Why do we see the reverse narrative in the media? Most of the tech industry in 2020 was saying that remote work was here to stay. Increase in productivity, employee well-being, and engagement were all quantifiable advantages employers were seeing from remote work. Today, we see a partial or total shift back to the office, and the question I have is why? Why was remote work the best thing to happen to work since the Industrial Revolution just 2 years ago, and now it's dead on arrival? To break this down, I need to give you the top 3 reasons employers are giving and what I believe is the actual real reason behind the curtain. First, the economy isn't doing well. Out of the S&P 500, only the top 7 companies have produced a positive return this year. 493 are down badly. This forcing back to the office is, in my opinion, layoffs in disguise, hoping that employees quit rather than going through costly layoffs. It's a pretty old hat playbook. Doing direct layoffs tells the market that you aren't doing well, which impacts your stock price and market confidence. Business owners have seen the studies that forcing people back to the office produces higher turnover. Having people leave on their own is the best of both worlds and allows companies to have their cake and literally eat it too, by keeping the perception that they're doing fine while still cutting their P&L. Next time you see another company announcing that they're going back to the office, the first thing I would personally check is their stock price. The second major reason is that corporate real estate is honestly, and I mean absolutely and royally, the biggest cost of a Fortune 500 company outside of their people is their real estate holdings. And as much as 30% of a company's assets on their balance sheets are property they own. If that property isn't being used, then that again could quite possibly be bad for their stock price. If you sold these properties, you'd easily incur a 30 to 50% loss on the value of those properties. Renting is even worse. The average office lease, where the tenant guts and rebuilds the space, ranges from 20 to 99-year leases. Not having employees in those offices shows a continuous monthly loss of the balance sheet. Lastly, we're seeing only 11% of companies fully utilizing their office spaces in commercial real estate accounts for a quarter of the loan portfolio value for large banks like Wells Fargo. Pre-COVID, 2% of real estate in San Francisco was vacant. Today, that number is 20% plus and rising. And this is after multiple pushes back to the office. The reality is that trillions of dollars in corporate real estate will need to take a 20, 30, 50% haircut for us to get back to the new reality of office pricing. Everyone knows this, but the return to the office propagandists are are trying to keep rearranging the chairs on the Titanic until we all sink under $1.5 trillion in corporate real estate loans that must be paid this year. Management needs to do something. In researching for my book on asynchronous organizations, link in description, go check it out if you are a remote work nerd like me, I found possibly the most surprising statistic in this book. In async companies, the managerial level is on average 50% thinner than their on-premise counterparts. The piece that nobody really wants to admit to is that if you're a manager, you don't have anywhere close to the same amount of busy work to do than before the pandemic. And there is the part here that is really hard for managers to hear. All the check-ins, the lunch meetings, the pizza parties, the birthday cake that you got for John on his birthday, those didn't really make any major difference. If anything, the data shows you that it hindered their overall productivity and output. The old school 20th century MBA playbook of lording over employees doesn't work online. If you stay late at the office on Fridays versus doing the same thing working from home, the manager can't see that and therefore can't see how hard you're working. Products like Time Doctor, as an example, can perfectly solve that problem, but it's a major issue that won't go away until managers focus on output more than inputs. Additionally, how you grow throughout a company is in a management role. Generally, the more people you manage, the more money you make. The system is incentivized to be focusing on getting more direct reports rather than getting more work done. This is a big issue that I really can't break down in this video, but generally, ego works a lot into this as well. Having the corner office, a personal assistant, a bunch of people to boss around gives you recognition and bragging rights that go far and beyond just getting more work done. This fundamental ego trip needs to change for us to move on to a bigger and better remote future. So here's what's really happening inside of the remote work movement. There was a term that's recently popped up in urban sociological circles coined by Stan van Nuremberg from Columbia University. It's called the urban doom loop. The reality, which the media does not want to admit to, is that employees are not returning to the office at anywhere near the rates that large multinationals need them to stabilize their portfolios. The data shows that remote and hybrid have expanded from 51% to 61% over the last 6 months based off the Flex Index data. And 3 major back-to-work data sets I follow, the Survey for Working Arrangements and Attitudes, the Census Household Pulse Survey, and the Castle Systems Public Transportation Usage Data Report, have all been found to be flat over the last 2 quarters. And there are indicators that by 2024, there will be more people working from home than there were in 2023. Because we're seeing this massive drop in office-based work that isn't going away, we're seeing the value decline in these office spaces as well. A reduction in property value means a reduction in property taxes, which means a reduction in city budgets, which in turn means a reduction in municipal government services like sanitation, transportation, urbanization, education, which only accelerates the fleeing of even more citizens from those cities, which in turn forces property value to fall more, which produces less money, which forces more people to move out, which further lowers property values. I think you get the idea of why this guy Stan from Columbia called it the urban doom loop. You might be thinking to yourself that if we lose a little property tax revenue, that isn't that bad for the overall economy. The more I've been researching this, the more terrified I've been getting. Guess what percentage of New York City's tax revenues comes from property taxes? Just guess. It's 42%. Commercial tax revenue is another 10%. So if that falls off by 30, 40, 50%, which it could easily do based off the data, you could see a 3 to 5% hole in the city budgets. That would be $3 to $5 billion lost in revenue for New York City alone. The rich make up the vast majority of city's tax base, but 40% of New York City's tax base comes from the 1%. As these people leave major cities for better work-life balance in either smaller cities or becoming nomadic, which also saw a 131% increase in comparison to pre-pandemic levels, you'll see cities that can become good places to live flourish, while cities that are good places to work fall apart. Lastly, and this is where you honestly have to put on your tinfoil hats, ladies and gentlemen, is to look at who started this movement back to the office. When did you first really start to hear about large companies, quote unquote, forcing employees back to the office because they lack connection, productivity, collaboration. I'll give you a minute if you really want to think about it.
1 minute later.
I think you know who those companies are. It was Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, Bridgewater, and Blackstone, backed up by consulting groups like Deloitte and KPMG. All those companies are worth about $20 trillion. And guess how much of that market cap is directly connected to corporate real estate? Corporate real estate isn't like the housing sector. It's based on debt being good. The average commercial real estate building is 65 to 75% debt. Usually you'll get a fixed rate loan and the loan only finances the debt, i.e. you don't pay off any principal. So I can take my profits into the next project without actually paying off the property I have. The point is not to pay off the property. And this system works perfectly if you assume the value of your property will always go up. Additionally, because we're dealing with massive companies that have millions of square feet in real estate in some cases, they can negotiate with the banks, and the majority have, that the loan isn't tied to any collateral. At the end of that fixed rate commercial real estate loan, when the bank assesses the value of the property for 50% less, I'm left with a choice. Invest a lot more capital that I don't have, or simply walk away and let the bank deal with it since it's debt that isn't collateralized to me or my company. This is what's happening right now. Best guess by the experts I've spoken to is that banks own about 60% plus of the $5.9 trillion in bad corporate real estate debt just in the United States. And we're looking at a collapse in value that will make the 2008 housing collapse look like a speed bump. 30+% of all real estate is corporate real estate. It's property that's never really owned, but put up as collateral to buy other assets. What's more solid than office buildings up until 2019? The biggest corporations in the world would like nothing more than for remote work to go away, so the backbone of their investment portfolio remains stable. Arguably, we're looking at banks holding the majority of debt for the worst asset class since the Dutch tulip bulbs in 1637. If you're still watching this video, and if you are, I'd love it if you could share this around if you agree with what I've laid out so far, maybe if you also disagree. The next question is, why is this so important? Why should I care that remote work is, in my opinion, a propaganda war? A war that I think we're losing, and losing pretty darn fast. If you don't start fighting against corporate interests, you could very well be next. There are, in my opinion, a few reasons why you should care. Number one, remote work is really good for workers. Remote work is the #1 request for millennials on down, and it's the single most important factor to impact overall productivity, sense of identity, and most importantly, retention inside of companies. Number two, remote work is even better for companies. If you hire the same people, remote work is on average 30% cheaper than their on-premise counterparts. Remote work reduces your carbon footprint by a whopping 58% in comparison to their in-office counterparts. Literally, if we had everyone that was working remote in March of 2020 just keep working from home, we'd hit all of our carbon footprint projections for the global economy. If you came to me and showed me that I was completely wrong, please, if you have sources, by the way, contrary to what I've said, put them down in the comments, and I'd love to break it down with everyone to see what the real facts are based off of their perspectives or your perspectives. I would be the first one to honestly go back to the office. But all the peer-reviewed non-corporate data shows that it's not true. The data shows that remote work is literally the best thing to happen to work since basically forever. Having a group of large companies that want to keep convincing you that it's not good for workers or for business owners frustrates the living hell out of me, as it hurts the people at the end of this entire chain, the workers, who I very much want to stand up for and support. Next time you talk to a business owner that says they have to get people back into the office, really ask them why, or better yet, send them this video so we can stop the propaganda from continuing and exposing these deceptions for what it is, a group of massive companies and out-of-date MBAs that don't want to get dragged in the 21st century. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. And if you really like this stuff, come to the conference, Running Remote. We do it every April. The next one will be in Lisbon, Portugal. I'd love to be able to see you there. And even if you hate everything that I said, you can come and argue with me. It's a broad tent. We'd love to be able to have those open debates. Thanks a lot for listening and watching. I'll see you in the next video.